This is Mike Louth. This morning we bring you a very unique Town Talk program. We'll speak to a retired U.S. Secret Service agent and an author who together have written a series of books about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy and also being assigned to protect 5 other presidents. You've probably never heard of Clint Hill, but almost everyone knows who he is and exactly what he did. On Friday, November the 22nd, 1963, when President Kennedy was assassinated and Texas Governor John Connally was shot at Dealey Plaza in downtown Dallas, Clint Hill was the Secret Service agent who was seen on the famous film shot by Abraham Zapruder, running to and jumping on the back of the presidential limousine, an attempt to protect Mr. President John F. Kennedy and his wife. Now, for nearly 50 years, Clint Hill and other agents assigned to the Kennedy detail just simply didn't speak out about the assassination. But a few years ago, a new author, Lisa McCubbin, and Clint Hill began writing a series of books that revealed never-before-known details about the assassination and also a behind-the-scenes look at protecting First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy. Their latest book, titled 5 Presidents, details Hill's involvement with the protection of Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, and Ford. KJS's Steve Stewart recently spoke to Hill and McCubbin in Houston about the Kennedy assassination. And also, Mr. Hill speaks very candidly about the 5 presidents which he protected and reveals some surprising information about them. Following the interview, we'll talk about how Jasper had a link to the aftermath of the assassination. First, we'll set the scene in Dallas for you. President and Mrs. Kennedy, along with Vice President Mrs. Johnson, arrived on Thursday, November the 21st, for a 4-day stay in the Lone Star State. The first 2 days were to be a whirlwind tour through San Antonio, Houston, and Fort Worth, as well as Dallas, followed by Austin, and finally 2 days of relaxation at the Johnson LBJ Ranch in the Texas Hill Country. On that Friday, shortly after arriving in Dallas, the presidential motorcade had just passed through the heart of downtown and was going to pass through Dealey Plaza before entering the Stemmons Freeway and arriving shortly thereafter at the Dallas Trade Mart for luncheon and presidential speech. The motorcade was led by an unmarked Dallas police car driven by Police Chief Jesse Curry and occupied by a Secret Service agent, followed by the presidential limousine with Secret Service code named SS-100-X, occupied by the president. And Mrs. Kennedy and Governor Mrs. Kennedy, that is, and Governor Mrs. Connally, followed by a retired presidential limousine, which was then being used as a Secret Service follow-up car with a Secret Service code named Halfback. It had been modified with running boards on each side for Secret Service personnel and agents to stand on. There were 4 agents on the running boards. Clint Hill was on the left running board, in front standing next to the driver, and he tells Steve Stewart what happened next.
Clint Hill, the limousine, has just made that left turn onto Elm Street in front of the Texas School Book Depository building. You hear a sound over your right shoulder.
Correct. There was a explosive noise. I didn't recognize it as a gunshot initially, but I was at the time scanning an area to the left, and when that happened, I turned toward the noise to see if I could identify what it was and where it came from. But I never got that far because my eyes, when they got to the back of the president's car, I saw his reaction and I realized it was a gunshot. So I jumped and I ran toward the presidential car with the intent to get up on top of the back of it to form a barricade or shield there for him to protect both President and Mrs. Kennedy and all the occupants of the car. Unfortunately, just as I approached the car, the third shot rang out, hit the president in the head, and it was a fatal wound, so I was just a little too late getting there. And then Mrs. Kennedy came up in the trunk. I grabbed her and put her back in the seat. When I did that, the president's body fell farther to his left into her lap. The reason that he fell only to his left, he was wearing a back brace, so he couldn't move forward, and he was sitting on the right side of the car, right up against the right door frame. So the only direction he could go was left. And also the jump seats that were being occupied by Governor and Mrs. Connally were very near the rear seats, and they were right up against the president's knees and Mrs. Kennedy's knees. So there wasn't much space for them to do anything.
Governor Connally, at one point you realized he had been hit also.
I didn't realize it until we were halfway to Parkland Hospital. He, at that point, was being covered up by Mrs. Connolly in the seat directly in front of President and Mrs. Kennedy. And at one point, she lifted up just a little bit, and he moved, and I could see that there was blood on his chest and his abdomen. And so I realized at that point that the governor had also been shot.
And at Parkland Hospital, it's my understanding that you had to move the governor first in order to get President Kennedy out.
That's correct. Because of the configuration of the car, we couldn't do anything for President Kennedy until we removed Governor Connolly, and we had to get him up, put him on a gurney before we could help the president anyway.
And understand there was another problem, that Mrs. Kennedy did not want to let go of her husband.
That's correct. She had a hold of him. After we got the governor up, she wouldn't let go, and I pleaded with her to allow us to help the president. I didn't get any response. And then I recognized that she really didn't want anybody to see the condition he was in, because it was horrible. And so I took off my suit coat and I covered up his head, his upper back, and as soon as I did that, she let go. We lifted him up, put him on a gurney, and ran into the emergency room.
You knew as soon as you saw the wound that his life had ended.
It was my assumption when I got up on top of the car after the third shot and he fell into his wife's lap that it was a fatal wound, because his eyes were fixed at that point, and the hole in the skull was, although it wasn't real large, it was large enough so I could see that all the brain matter was gone from that area.
And we lost the president that day. Lisa McCubbin, an author who has a background in radio and television, a TV anchor, radio personality, doing exactly what I'm doing now for many years. What brought you to write a book in the first place?
Well, let's see. I don't know where to begin. I was actually working on a completely different book. I had a literary agent. It wasn't really going anywhere. And a longtime friend of mine came to me, Jerry Blaine, and he had been working on writing a book. With my background in television news, I did a lot of writing. And he asked me if I would help him to get his book written and published. And so I did. And it was during the writing of that book when I met Clint Hill, because we needed his memories of what happened in Dallas, because the other agent had not been in Dallas that day.
And for the folks listening, Jerry Blaine was a Secret Service agent on the Kennedy detail.
Yes, he was. And that first book was called The Kennedy Detail. It was published in 2010. So he introduced me to Clint, and at first Clint did not want to talk to me. He had no interest in contributing to a book or writing a book himself. He had buried his memories and really did not want to discuss the assassination. But what ended up happening is we met in August of 2009. He gave me 2 hours, and at the end of the meeting, he made a mistake. He gave me his phone number. Mm-hmm. Well, I was a reporter, so I used that phone number. And it turned out that over the course of the next few months, as I would call him and ask him questions, he slowly started revealing the details of the assassination and those dreadful days afterward, and things that he really had never talked about in almost 50 years, and it was very healing for him to do so.
What was the first book title?
The first book that I wrote, that Clint helped with, was called The Kennedy Detail, JFK's Secret Service Agents Break Their Silence. And then Clint finally agreed to write a book himself, and that first book was called Mrs. Kennedy and Me. And that was published in 2012, and it's the story of his extraordinary relationship with Jacqueline Kennedy, the 4 years that he was her Secret Service agent assigned to her. They became very close, had a wonderful relationship, and it's just, a great story that few people know about.
Right. And the latest book is out now.
Yes, and actually after Mrs. Kennedy and Me, we followed it up with 5 Days in November about the assassination, and the latest book is 5 Presidents, which came out in May of 2016, and we're very proud of it. I think people will find it interesting that man that they know in all those pictures and in the Zapruder film, that he didn't just disappear after that day. He went on and he served total of 5 presidents throughout his career, and he had quite an extraordinary career serving Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford.
He would never say it, but a true American hero.
He is. And he doesn't like to be acknowledged as such. He's a very humble man, but he really is an American hero.
That's right. 5 presidents, that's a lot of men to cover. And of course, you started out as a very young man with Eisenhower. What's your fondest memory of Mr. Eisenhower?
Well, he was just a wonderful man and very easy to deal with. He was, he spent most of his career in the military, and he brought that military bearing with him to the Oval Office. He treated us like we were his troops. We had the utmost respect for him. When we traveled with him around the world, he was revered by people all over the world. No matter where we went, if we were in a motorcade, there would be hundreds of thousands, millions of people that would turn out to see him.
And then President Kennedy, a fresh breath for the country.
Young, vibrant, vigorous young man, 43 years old, and who had been in World War II. He had this young family, a 3-year-old daughter and a wife who was about to deliver a new baby. So it was going to be a new experience for all of us to have that type of operation. But he was so friendly. He knew all of us by name. He called us by our first names. He always looking out for the agents, making sure that everything was okay for them. When he first went to Palm Beach, Florida, before he was even inaugurated, the agents that came there came from all over the country, and they all had suits and ties and everything. He went in his house and from his personal shirt collection, brought out polo shirts and asked the guys to put them on so they could be comfortable. He said, "You can do your job better if you're comfortable." He was just that kind of a person.
And then President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Could it be fairly said that you first saw your few gray hairs under that administration?
Well, probably so. He was so unpredictable. He never really knew what he was going to do next. But he was a bigger-than-life individual with really knew how to handle the power of the presidency by dealing with Congress. He knew everybody in Congress, the good and the bad about each and every one of them, and he used that to his advantage. He was a real deal maker. He tried his best to figure out a way to get out of Vietnam, but was never successful, and that's what, in the end, cost him not to run for the presidency.
And that brought us to President Nixon. Were there moments where you just scratched your head during the Nixon administration?
Yes, there were. Some of the things he did were just almost beyond comprehension. One of them was that we had massive demonstrations in Washington. Hundreds of thousands of young people came there, anti-war and anti-Nixon. And we had made elaborate preparations to secure the entire White House complex. We had brought in city buses and put them bumper to bumper around the entire complex so that nobody could even get close to getting into the complex itself. Well, at 4:30 in the morning, he decides he wants to go down to the Lincoln Memorial because he wants to see these students and these protesters. And the guys that were working the midnight shift took him down there, and he sat there and had his valet with him, and a doctor who happened to be on duty came with him also. But some of the questions he asked the students, the agents told me later that they just didn't make sense. And so from that point on, we had really a question about how he was, what his problems were. We didn't really know. But even his own staff was concerned about how he was doing things. So he was a different character to occupy the office than we had ever faced before.
When Watergate broke, you were actually somewhat involved. You learned about that from the beginning.
Well, I was notified of the break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters the night that it happened. And I was advised of what had happened and who had been arrested. And the names were given to me. And I notified my superiors of what had happened and who the names were. And it became apparent to us that one of the names on that list of 5 was, in fact, an employee of the Committee to Re-elect the President, which was a group or an organization that the White House staff and the President Nixon had set up to handle the 1972 presidential election. And this particular individual, his expertise was listening devices, and he had previously worked for the CIA. And because we knew that he was an employee of this group and he was involved in the break-in. There seemed to be some tie between what happened at Watergate led right back to the White House staff.
And then you moved to President Ford. How was that? Did you have enjoyable moments then?
Oh yeah, President Ford was just like the man next door. He, in fact, lived not very far from me in Alexandria, Virginia. And his youngest son and my oldest son were classmates in T.C. Williams High School, graduated together, and he spoke at their commencement. But he was just a wonderful human being, very easy to deal with. Everybody liked him. Can't say enough good things about Jerry Ford.
One last question. We know you come to Texas periodically. When you come to the Lone Star State, is there any place that you say we have to go eat there? What's your favorite place or thing about Texas?
Probably the people is the favorite thing. They're wonderful people down here. I don't think I have a specific restaurant that I would know that I would go to. Do you, Lisa?
No, I can't think of one.
Well,
We've
been everywhere in Texas. Fort Worth, Dallas, Austin, Houston. We've been all over Texas, so and we enjoy it very much. We'll be coming back.
Well, good. It's always great to have you. Clint Hill, retired U.S. Secret Service agent, Lisa McCubbin, incredible author, and we appreciate you. From Houston, Steve Stewart,
Thank you,
KJS.
Steve. Shortly after the assassination of President Kennedy, Dallas police discovered that one employee of the Texas School Book Depository was unaccounted for. He was identified as 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald. Later that afternoon, Oswald shot and killed Dallas police officer J.D. Tippett, and he then fled on foot to a nearby movie theater, where he was finally apprehended. The investigation later concluded that Oswald was the lone assassin of Kennedy, although that finding has been disputed by many in the nearly 53 years since the event. Now, 2 days after the assassination, on the morning of Sunday, November the 24th, while being moved from the Dallas City Jail to the Dallas County Jail, Oswald was shot and killed by Dallas nightclub owner Jack Ruby. The murder was witnessed by millions of Americans who saw it happen on nationwide TV. Now, just a few days later, Jasper, Texas, was involved in the mix of the Kennedy assassination. Therefore, shortly after officially charged with the murder of Oswald, Jack Ruby employed Jasper attorney Joe Tonnehill and San Francisco, California attorney Melvin Billi to defend him. On March the 14th, 1964, following a 6-week trial, Jack Ruby was convicted of murder with malice and received the death sentence. In October of 1966, Tonnehill was successful in getting the Texas Court of Appeals to reverse Ruby's murder conviction on the grounds of improper admission of testimony and the fact that Ruby could not have received a fair trial in Dallas. In January of 1967, while awaiting a new trial in Wichita Falls, Ruby died of lung cancer in a Dallas hospital. Now, Joe Tonnehill himself died in 2001, and now the Jasper County Historical Museum on the Jasper County Courthouse Square has a large glass encased exhibit containing most of the items in Joe Tonnehill's office just as it appeared in the 1960s. We hope that you've enjoyed today's very unique Town Talk. For Steve Stewart, I'm Mike Loud, hoping that you have